Welcome everyone. Thank you for being here at the McGill Physics Unit Friday noon seminar. I'm your host, Pete Watson. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Jericho O'Connell. He was born and raised in Victoria, BC, completed his Ph.D. in physics at the University of Victoria, supervised by Magdalena Basilova-Carter, who is actually one of our alum. He's currently working now as a postdoc on multi-layer detector development in the Ross Burbico group at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Harvard Medical School in or near Boston. We're not quite sure with that. So today he's going to be talking to us about low-cost external beam radiotherapy machine design considerations. And with that, I will pass it over to Jericho.
Okay, thank you. That's nice introduction. Again, the cities of Boston are rather complicated, and I know I'm near Boston, but I might be in Brookline. So, oh, I shared the wrong screen. So we even rehearsed which screen I was going to share before, but then I forgot. Let's present. Okay. And I think you can see it. So today I'm talking about low-cost external beam radiotherapy machine sort of design considerations. And this is work that I did during my PhD at the University of Victoria. And I guess a fun tidbit about the University of Victoria, if you look at the logo, it's very similar to McGill's because UVic was once an associated school at McGill when it started. So yeah, fun little McGill connection. And okay, I'll get started. If people on the Zoom, if some of you wouldn't mind turning your cameras on, I think it would be helpful because I can't see anybody's reaction. And when I can't see anybody's reaction, I just get lost. Thanks, Magdalena. Okay. So we're talking about low-cost radiotherapy and especially access to radiotherapy, because even though we have a lot of radiotherapy machines in our neck of the woods, a large portion of the world has few or no radiotherapy machines. And additionally, in our neck of the woods, you might go to maybe northern Quebec or northern British Columbia, and again, you'd have fairly little access to radiotherapy because, especially if you're palliative, you wouldn't want to travel to an urban center. So it's kind of a problem that affects a lot of places and a lot of patients. And as a case study to kind of look at this, there is this study that came out of a hospital in India, and there they treat of their head and neck treatments, about more than half of them only receive radiation as a treatment. And of that radiation, about 62% of it is delivered on cobalt machines still. And really the reason is that it's quite low cost, the cobalt. So it's only $500 Canadian for a course of treatment. Even though they have more modern LINACs, like this older LINAC model, but it's 3 times the cost. So people tend not to choose it as their treatment method. And they even have some image-guided radiotherapy available at this hospital, but only a very small fraction will end up using it because it's so expensive. So the idea behind this project was to propose a machine that was lower cost than these options, because hypothetically, there's a group of patients that can't afford any of these options, maybe. So that would increase the access. And then additionally, we wanted to provide image guidance capability on this machine so that you could treat better than maybe what you get from a cobalt. So in terms of the initial idea for this machine was to have a scanning electron source that hit a number of different targets in the treatment head, and in this way you'd have this converging beam, and this overcomes the big problem with treating with kilovoltage beams, because I didn't say, but we're looking at treating with kilovoltage because it's lower cost. So there was a lot of work that went into this design between Magdalena and Dylan Brakritz, who's in Toronto now, and it was done in collaboration with Marc-Andre Renaud and Jan Sundtjens, who were at McGill at the time, so a bit of a McGill connection. And here's a schematic of what it would look like with this X-ray source that's convergent and a collimator, and then it would rotate around the patient to provide arc treatment. And when you did this, you can see that these kilovoltage arc therapy treatments, or KVAT treatments, could provide pretty close dose distributions, pretty tight dose distributions to this dotted line PTV in a centrally located lung tumor. And all that while you're minimizing skin dose as well, which is a very big problem in kilovoltage treatments. And this is compared to VMAT, and you can see it compares quite favorably. So this had all been done previous to my time at UVic, but it turned out that this design wasn't quite as low cost as anticipated, and additionally, it's hard to manufacture the head as it was envisioned. So we switched to a different type of device, and here's the prototype that's being made with a company called Orimtech in Chicago, and in collaboration with Serious Medicine, which is a startup in California, mostly Michael Weil. And here is a prototype machine, and you can see it's acquiring a cone beam CT right here. And it's a little simpler. It has the two robots holding a flat panel and an X-ray source. And I call it the SITKA machine. I'm not sure if anybody else calls it that, but I was writing papers, so I got to name it what I wanted. And it's named after the SITKA tree, SITKA spruce tree. And you can see a stellar example of that beneath the logo, the largest SITKA spruce in Canada, in fact, which is not far from UVic if you're ever in the area. So now we have this prototype. So what I wanted to do, what we wanted to do, was to look at what treatments from this machine would look like. And I'm a bit of a Monte Carlo guy, so I looked at it all in Monte Carlo to look what a treatment plan for a lung patient would look like delivered by this machine, and compare it to a lung SABR treatment, and then compare it to the RTOG 813 guidelines for lung SABR, which are kind of an accepted standard for delivering lung SABR. So a kind of more in-depth overview of the system. You have these isocentric gantries, which we went with robots, and they're not too expensive. They look fancy, but they're not too expensive. And then you have a kilovoltage source, which is a 320 kVp source, and it's an industrial source because they're lighter as a payload for a robot. And then iris collimation is imagined in my Monte Carlo models, but it's not yet fitted to the machine, as far as I know. And then opposite the source is a KV detector for imaging. And it's important that this robot be able to deliver non-coplanar angles as well as helical angles so that you can spread out the skin dose. So to highlight the cost savings, I guess, because it's low cost and that you have to come back to that, the KV X-ray tube and iris collimator are much less expensive than the LINAC equivalent. You only need 5 millimeters of lead shielding, big selling point, because you don't need a thick concrete bunker, which can be hard to construct in low income settings. And then we would imagine a workflow without planning CT, because it's hard to say, oh, we have a really low cost treatment machine, but then you also need a planning CT, which that doesn't seem low cost. So we're trying to do a workflow without planning CT. So this is some stuff I just looked up on robots to try and sell you on the fact that they're not very expensive. So we have a lot of them in Canada. So they would be pretty easy to maintain, I'd imagine, because you have parts and people who can maintain them. And then if you were to buy one on eBay, similar to the ones that we have, only $25,000. Not that we're buying them on eBay, but they're not that expensive. So kind of back to the treatment plans. I guess here's the dose distribution for a KV beam, and you can see that you don't have the buildup and you have low dose at depth. So when you do a Monte Carlo dose calculation for an arc, you can see that the dose is accumulating almost exclusively on the skin. But if you do 2 non-coplanar arcs as well, and then you have an optimizer that can weight them, you can again get these pretty close distributions around the PTV without too much skin dose. So an overview of the whole envisioned workflow would be to have cone beam CT acquisition. And then you need some sort of augmentation to synthetic CT, because you can't really plan that well off of cone beam CT due to the streaking artifacts and non-uniformity. And then you'd have some auto contouring functionality based off of this, as well as radiation oncology contouring, and then all sorts of treatment planning that would happen, and then hopefully treatment plan approval and delivery. And we'd imagine doing this in one session. So to start with the machine learning augmentation, the method that we used was a method by Johns Hopkins that they developed, and it has a GAN for creating the synthetic CT, but it also has a 3D unit for segmenting. So, but it only took 128 voxel cube images, so we had to do a little bit of additional work to make it accept a full volume. And here's the result on one of our patients. And you can see that it reduces the artifact and it makes it more homogeneous. And then it also gives it the HU values that the treatment planning algorithms or the Monte Carlo code expects for CT, because cone beam CT and CT have slightly different values in terms of HU. And then here's the auto contouring, and it might not impress you that much if you've worked with other auto contouring, but the reason it's not quite as good as what you think is that a lot of auto contouring uses the planning CT as input. So when you don't have planning CT as input, which was necessary in this model because we don't want planning CT, you get a little worse results. But that's a work in progress. So now that we had that, you go to the non-coplanar treatment planning. And this tends to be computationally expensive. So a way around that was to have an initial step of GPU ray tracing to get initial estimates of the dose at all the angles that you were planning to hypothetically treat at. This is GPU ray tracing through the spine, shown in red, and through the PTV, shown in green. So when we do the ray tracing, we calculate the attenuation in these structures, and we use it as a proxy for dose. So then for each of the angles, you calculate the attenuation in the organs at risk, attenuation in the PTV, and based off these two values, you can make as a cost for each of your different angles. So based on this cost, we decide which angles we want to include in further optimization. So we reject a lot of angles that might be shooting directly through the spine or not giving much dose to the PTV. So now that we've selected some angles, what we do is we back project the attenuation into the PTV again, and then you can get kind of a rough estimate of what sort of dose the PTV would be getting. So here it is, and it's showing a bit of a cold spot in the center of the tumor. So based on this initial estimate, we'll include additional fields to try and address that cold spot. And then you can repeat this until you have something that looks sufficiently uniform. And then from there, we do Monte Carlo dose calculations for each of these fields. And then we would weight these based on a DVH dose metric that I constructed to specifically meet the RTOG criteria, because it was really hard to meet these RTOG criteria for the KTV plan. So the planning got really complicated, and it didn't mean to be this complicated. I would have rather had it less complicated, but it ended up this way. So to talk about the RTOG criteria, if we're looking at a PTV, and the PTV in this case is outlined in the bright red, a lot of it has to do with the volume of that PTV compared to your 100% prescription and your 50% prescription. So we define the R100, which is the ratio of the 100% prescription isodose surface to the area of the PTV. And this has to be less than 1.2 for the two patients that we looked at. And then you can also look at the R50, the ratio of the 50% prescription isodose surface to the PTV. And this had to be less than 4 for the patients that we looked at. And it's a little different depending on your tumor size. But this becomes challenging because the KV system likes to deposit dose in bone. So the 50% isodose, if you look at it in that image, it tends to try and wrap around your bony anatomy, which are really good KV absorbers. So it was a little tricky to do. And then the other criteria, there are lots of criteria, but these ones were the hard ones to meet for our planning. And it's that you can't have dose outside of an area of your PTV plus 2 centimeters. The whole rest of the patient has to receive no hot spots of a certain dose. So for the different size of tumors, it was 31 or 28 gray. And this can be hard because you might have bony anatomy outside of the PTV, and it'll absorb KV radiation really well, and then you'll have a hot spot, which can violate this. So when we looked at these, it turns out that we could pass on All of them, some of them barely squeaking past, but these two plans passed. And when you look specifically at these plans, I'll look at the better looking of the two. Or actually, I'll look at the metrics first. So the max dose is decreased by about 7 and 5 gray in the two patients we looked at. So this is a common feature of when you can use all these non-coplanar angles, your organs at risk tend to have a lower max dose, because I can pretty much avoid treating through the spine altogether. Whereas in VMAT, you're doing one arc and you have to treat a little bit through the spine. But since you have all these angles, your mean dose increases slightly. Again, this DVH curve is telling that story. You can see that the trachea, for example, in the VMAT plan, which is a solid line, it has a bit more of a higher dose. The max dose is higher, whereas for the SITKA plan, since we don't treat right through it, you don't get that high dose. But you tend to have a higher low dose bath. So here's what they look like. If you compare in plane, in the VMAT plane, the plans look really good. And of course, this is because we use so much non-coplanar angles. When you look at the same plane as the VMAT, it tends to look quite good because you don't shoot through the spine like the VMAT does, and you don't shoot through the heart like the VMAT does. But when you look at out of plane, you tend to see how much of the low dose bath is extended using the SITKA treatment as compared to the VMAT treatment. So kind of to summarize, we have this prototype of this low-cost non-coplanar system, and we were able to demonstrate RTOG compliance on these two patients, not a huge cohort. We have these lower organ at risk max doses. And then I'll kind of talk about the future applications that we imagine, which are to deliver veterinary treatments, as well as perhaps using adjuvants like gold nanoparticles in these treatments. And one of my favorite things, although we haven't done very much work on it, is contrast enhanced radiation therapy, which I think would fit in well in a low cost environment. So here's the cone beam CT again. So the new patients we're looking at, they're very cute. They're mostly dogs. And I tried to, here's a rendering of one of the patients that Magdalena did. And this patient has a tumor in its nose, and it kind of extends into the brainstem. So I like to show this as kind of a different type of patient as compared to the lung patients who are well suited to this treatment. This dog is about as poorly suited to a KV treatment as you could see, because the GTV, which you can see in red here, it's almost completely surrounded by bone, which is hard for the KV treatment. And it's also very close to the skin, which is again reduces the effectiveness of the non-coplanar angles. But that being said, oh, and a fun thing is that the vet clinic that we have next to the University of Victoria has a halcyon. And I think it's kind of funny to UBC Kelowna, who thought they were getting the first halcyon in BC, but actually the vet clinic by UVic got the first halcyon in BC, I believe. So they have a very sophisticated setup. And this is what they'd give as a treatment for this lesion. You can see it extending into the brainstem. And this treatment would be really hard on the dog because you're going into the mouth a lot and you're going into the brain quite a bit. And when I tried to plan on the KV device, you can see that my optimizer isn't quite as sophisticated to really do what the VMAT could do with the MLC. So I can't quite get the arbitrary anatomy of the GTV, but it does spare the skin quite a bit, and I think it does a pretty good job. So it can't pass any RTOG criteria for such a lesion, but it can do a pretty good job. And then the second thing to talk about is gold nanoparticles. And the one thing about these high atomic number nanoparticles is they're demonstrably quite a lot more effective when you use KV radiation because they tend to absorb photoelectrically a lot better. So you can get, from this paper by Jan Schumann's group, if you lower the mean energy of your radiation, you can get an enhancement factor of like roughly 3 times, whereas as you start going up, you're at the 1.5. So you can imagine having these adjuvants, but you need a machine to create these KV treatment plans, and there currently isn't one. So even though this is imagined for a low-cost setting, if you had a really killer way to deliver nanoparticles, it might give a really good treatment plan, even in high-income settings or at research hospitals. It might be of interest. So here's something kind of demonstrating this as well, that if you don't have any gold nanoparticles and you do a Monte Carlo simulation of this kind of toy model of a brain tumor in an XCAT phantom, you get such high absorption in the skull as compared to the PTV. But if you include a fairly modest amount of gold nanoparticles to be in the tumor, then you get quite a good accumulation of dose in the tumor as compared to the skull, which is quite beneficial. And then the second topic is to talk about contrast enhanced radiotherapy. And this is quite beneficial because as opposed to the gold nanoparticles, which prove to be quite an expensive way to treat patients because those drugs can be quite expensive and are hard to imagine in the low and middle income setting. Michael Weil, who's our collaborator, did some previous work in contrast enhanced radiotherapy, and this would be to inject the patient with iodine in their tumor prior to treatment, and then you get a very ablative dose in the region that has received the iodine. And then to try and do this in conjunction with immunotherapy showed some really promising preliminary results in terms of systemic anti-tumor immunity, which is a fairly exciting biological thing. So maybe if you were to have in a lower income setting just to inject the lesion with iodine, you could have a really good treatment and it's not very expensive. So that's kind of interesting on the biological side that you could do perhaps with this machine. So yeah, this is kind of our attempt to address the access to radiotherapy problem, to put a new device on the market that's not super fancy, but has a lot of exciting applications. And also for the rural and remote places that you can maybe imagine having one of these machines in Yellowknife when you can never really imagine having a cancer center there. So yeah, thanks a lot for listening. I didn't use up my full 50 minutes. I thought I might, but I guess I just talked too fast. And thanks to all my collaborators, and Serious Medicine and Magdalena have been so wonderful. And Olivia from our group, who might be on the call. She's actually taking over this project from me. So she's, if you want to talk about collaboration, Magdalena and Olivia are good people to talk to. Yeah, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much. Very, very interesting project. Lots of time for questions, which is not a bad thing. I mean, we can have a bit of a chit chat. So, does anyone have any questions right off the bat? I wrote down two, but I can wait. Hussein, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks. It's really impressive. It's really nice. I'm just wondering about the optimization process. So I assume, like, adding a new surfaces and a new, like paths of movements for the treatment head adds a lot of, like, degrees of freedom. So how did you, like, what could you talk a little bit about the optimization process? Like, what algorithm did you use? How how many hyperparameters does it have, and how long does it take, and so on and so forth? Yeah.
So I'll try and select the right slide. Okay, I think this is a good slide. So to start, I just use GPU ray tracing through the Tigre. It's French, so you have to say Tigre. I would want to say Tiger. Python package, and so it's all analytical to start. And from that, I just get the attenuation estimate, which is just, I used to do a lot of CT, so it's kind of more of an imaging sort of thing to do, but you just get the attenuation in your different structures that I have from the structure set that are segmented from the structure set. So I get attenuation in these objects. And then from there, I just construct this cost function, which is a weighted average of the attenuation it rewards attenuation in the PTV, and then it penalizes attenuation in the organs at risk with different weighting factors for each organ. So that's kind of, and then based on that, I just accept the best however many angles to go into my further optimization. And then I'm not sure, do you want to go, I'm not sure, what specifically are you interested in?
Yeah, that's cool. So I guess like the time consuming process would be the ray tracing part, like just like knowing what is the impact, like what a certain angle, a certain geometry of the patient, beams are coming this way, like, is that the time consuming? Okay.
This doesn't take very much time. It takes about maybe 30 seconds. So that's not very time consuming. Right now, like, what is time consuming is, like, ideally we'd want something that's not Monte Carlo right here. Because we do Monte Carlo dose calculations. And a big thing we're working on is trying to get an analytical model that can do our dose calculations, because we don't really have, like, you can't really use Eclipse because they don't handle KV beams. So we'd want to make our own in-house dose calculation that was moderately. So right now, if that's the big roadblock, is this is all pretty fast, but then we do a Monte Carlo dose calculation, which takes, like, I don't know, depends on how many cores, but a couple hours a day. So that's what's really slow. Does that answer?
Cool. Yeah, thank you so much.
Cool.
Good. I think Sharon had her hand up next. if you are still interested in asking a question, Sharon.
Yes, sorry, I didn't find my unmute button. Thank you, Jericho. It was a very interesting presentation. I'm a little bit curious about, so you said that this would be a bit of a cheaper option.
Yes.
What would it cost, say, including, and you didn't mention, maybe you did, I didn't pay attention, shielding of a room, say that you would install this as a center in Africa or India. What would it totally cost, for example, just looking? And what, for example, here in one of our teaching hospitals at McGill, we have a orthovoltage machine where we treat, it's very busy actually, we treat a lot of head and neck and skin lesions. Compared to that, what does your machine offer? Because ours is very cheap compared to this machine, for example.
I guess compared to the regular orthovoltage unit, this would be able to treat deep-seated lesions would be the benefit that we envision, something that could perhaps replace the role of a true beam in our centers. Perhaps we could have these kilovoltage units that since they can do the non-coplanar treatments, they can treat more deep-seated lesions, would be the perhaps what we're looking for. In terms of like the actual cost, we don't completely know, but it would be ballpark, I'd say $200,000 would be ballpark what we're thinking. Of course, when you get into software that we might want to use from companies, you don't know how much they're going to ask for that, and we might need to use those. So, but ballpark about 200,000 for the hardware side, and then the real good thing is that even a Cobalt machine has these $1 million maintenance contracts, but I think what we'd be able to provide is something that has a lot cheaper maintenance would be kind of one of the benefits. Does that answer some of the questions?
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks. We have a question from the room at the Glen. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was mostly answered. I had a question about the operational cost, because we have only been talking about upfront cost and not operational cost. But you just mentioned like the maintenance is much cheaper for this machine than it would for a Cobalt machine, right? But
yeah.
What about power supply? Because I can imagine I can, send a Cobalt source in the middle of the jungle and operate a Cobalt machine. But what about, like how? Forget about maintenance, just operation costs. How would they compare your machine versus a Cobalt machine?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I don't want to say anything bad about Cobalt machines, because I think they're really cool and I think they really have a good place. And there are a lot of places where this machine wouldn't work that a Cobalt machine would work because of that exact. Like Cobalt machines do need power, so they still do, because they need to move their gantry. If you can't move your gantry, then you're sunk with a Cobalt machine too. But they don't need quite the high voltage that this machine would, because when you're looking at 320 kVp, you need 2 high voltage power supplies, which need a fairly sophisticated electrical grid. But I think as far as I can see, this machine might not work in some of the lower income settings, but I think there are a lot of places or cancer centers that might have one LINAC, or this hospital in the case study in India that had many LINACs. But if it could supplement those LINACs with a bunch of these machines that could provide like even lower cost treatments, I think that could be quite beneficial in some ways. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, if the bottleneck is having a strong grid, then if the center that has a strong grid, they'll just use a mid-tier Linux. And if they don't have the strong grid, then use Cobalt. So I guess it started to narrow down where this machine is actually effective, right? I guess you can, you said you can add more machines because the upfront cost is lower.
Yeah, I guess a big barrier to treatment is that even an old LINAC, you need to make a cement bunker to install it. You need Varian to maintain it. Whereas this machine, you might envision a treatment cost that was a fraction of what they would pay up front for treatment on that LINAC. So we believe that there's still a large demand.
I mean, now you need serious medicine to maintain it.
Well, I think since we're using ABB robot, you could need ABB Robotics, which is a larger global company to maintain the robots, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you.
Good. We have a question from Sebastian.
Hello, hi. Thank you very much, Jericho, for the presentation. It was very interesting. I am working on segmentation for my project as well. And I think you mentioned you used one algorithm from Johns Hopkins University. And you said you made some tweaks because the model could only work with like 128 volumes.
Yes.
What did you have in mind?
So I actually pushed my changes to the README in their GitHub repository. So you can read a summary there also, but I'll also describe what I did. I guess what I did is I downsampled my volume by 2 so that it was at half the resolution. And then I put those images through the network so that I could get a low resolution stitching of the full volume. And then I used that as kind of a map to do a high resolution stitching. So I would do a high resolution image of each piece of my volume. And then I would compare that to the low resolution stitching such that I wouldn't get really different output from my low resolution and high resolution. Does that make sense? You just have
it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, okay, then that's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Nice. I have some questions I guess I can ask. Who was it? Someone asked about the treatment planning part, and then you were like, well, this is all pretty fast until we get to the Monte Carlo dose calc. Is there a fundamental issue, or is it just the implementation of doing like a convolution superposition algorithm for KV photons? Because that's essentially what you'd need to do, right, to make this really fast?
Yeah, exactly. So that's what we're looking to do. It's just, it takes some time to make your own in-house convolution superposition. So that's kind of exactly what Olivia, who's working on this project, is doing. Yeah, good.
So I was just curious, is the problem that it is fundamentally difficult to create such a code for KV photons, or it's just a big project to do, but there's nothing?
Yeah, it's not fundamentally different. No, we don't think so. It's not too different. It's just you need to put in the time to make a product, and it's taking some time. And we're a pretty small team. So if any of you, I know McGill's very good at doing computational stuff. So if anybody has some interest, I'm sure Magdalena, she loves to collaborate.
It's a good pitch. Get your name on the paper.
Yeah.
Cool, thanks. My other question was, right from the very start, your cone beam CT images are pretty streaky, more streaky than most CBCT images I've seen. Do you think that's just because of your particular setup? I would imagine those streaks don't look like beam hardening. They look like you might be having some vibrations, or you're not, like view to view, you're having some misalignments. Do you think that, like, what's your...
Yeah, I think they're motion artifacts, perhaps, from breathing motion during the acquisition. So, but I think that's what you deal with in lung cone beam CT. And of course, the neural network looks better when your initial cone beam CT looks worse. So it was but yeah, I think we think that they might be the motion artifacts, and perhaps preventable if you have hypersight or whatever you might want to use, but we don't have hypersight. So.
Cool. And my last question was, you were talking about doing veterinarian therapy, and I guess it's just, you talked about RTOG requirements. Like, do those apply to animals?
No, I think I was speaking a little too off the cuff there. No, I don't think they do. I'm sure there are boards of people that make guidelines, but I haven't looked into them. So
it's probably more challenging to have it apply to an animal than for human, because they're developed for humans. So
yeah, I think maybe Olivia will have to deal with that, but we didn't get far enough to. But it's very interesting to go into the veterinary center. They do very cool things, and they have very cool tools. So it was quite exciting to get involved with them.
Nice. All right, that's all the questions for me. Anyone else has anything they want to ask? If you don't feel like asking out loud, if you type it in the chat, I'll read it out loud. But aside from your research, do you have any plans to try to improve your fastest known time on the Juan de Fuca Marine Trail?
No, I don't. That was...
So for context, I Googled Jericho's name, because that's what you do, and his name popped up. So he's a trail runner, and you have the fastest time running the out and back of the Juan de Fuca Marine Trail, which is on Vancouver Island. And this is I've never done it myself, but I know people take multiple days to hike this trail. You did it in like 18 hours or something crazy?
Yes, it was this is a weird mixing of my interests, but yes, I did do. That was one of the longest days of my life, where I was running for 18 hours, and it was. We actually were running in the dark, and we saw a cougar on the trail. So it was quite an exciting day. If that's an advertisement for what you can find in Victoria, that's it was
Legacy.
Yeah, it's very good.
All right, well, if we don't have any other questions, I'd like to thank you once again for your fantastic talk. And I'd like to thank everyone for being here, and we'll see you all at our next seminar. So thank you, and have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Same.
Bye-bye.